It's been extremely disturbing for them to have to deal with the shooting death of a 3-year-old girl. The father of the Sydney toddler has been charged with possessing a prohibited and unregistered sawn-off shotgun, as well as breaching an apprehended domestic violence order. His 3-year-old daughter died at her mother's Laylaw Park home last night. For more, we're joined now by the ABC's Sydney police reporter, Jessica Kidd. Jessica, this is such a disturbing story. What are the police saying today about the circumstances of this shooting?
Eleanor, that's right. This is a really disturbing case and a very tragic story that's happened. Now, what police have been able to tell us is that just after 8 o'clock last night at a house in Laylaw Park in Sydney's west, where this little 3-year-old girl lived with her mother and 3 older brothers, there were gunshots. A gunshot rang out and the girl was shot in the neck. Now, police and paramedics were called, but the girl died at the scene from that wound. And we're hearing reports from neighbours who heard the gunshot that the girl's mother was beside herself. She was hysterical, yelling out as paramedics tried to treat the little girl, "Not my baby, not my baby." Another man, who we now understand to be the girl's father, was seen sitting in a gutter with his head in his hands, rocking backwards and forwards while police were there trying to process what had happened. What we know is that the 3-year-old was in the house with her 3 older siblings who were aged between 3 and 8, her mother and her father, when she was injured by this gunshot. Now, police are still investigating this, and given that there are children involved, that process of investigation is going to take a long time because specialist officers have to speak to the children as well as the mother and the father. But police are investigating whether the 3-year-old may have shot herself or whether this was an accident involving the other children. But one thing is clear, that there was an unregistered prohibited firearm in that house. It wasn't secured properly, and Acting Superintendent Paul Corrett said that this just emphasises how important it is to store firearms safely. Here's a bit of what he said earlier.
We'd also just like to take the opportunity to reiterate the need to keep firearms safe at all times, to keep them stored in accordance with the legislation.
So that's the police superintendent in charge there, Paul Corrett. Jessica, what more can you tell us about the charges against the little girl's father?
Yes, well, police have told us that the 43-year-old man who lives at Arncliffe in Sydney's southwest, so he doesn't live with the family and the mother, has been charged with not keeping a firearm safely, possessing a prohibited and unregistered firearm, and he's also facing 2 counts of breaching an apprehended domestic violence order, which we understand relates to the mother. Now, that man faced Blacktown Local Court earlier today, and he's been refused bail on those charges. But the charges are serious. They as the superintendent, Paul Corrett, said, it's an extremely serious issue when firearms aren't stored properly, and this is the tragic outcome of that.
Jessica Kidd, the ABC senior police reporter, thank you.
Okay, well, that's the 7th or 8th time that I've heard that, or heard ABC Radio's coverage of that. Perhaps even the 9th time. It started with the 6 o'clock news at sunrise. And there's been various versions of it. It was either a gunshot heard by the neighbours, or it was gunshots heard by the neighbours. It varies somewhat according to which report. In that particular one, the same reporter described it as gunshot, gunshots, and gunshot. So I'm going to go with the idea that if a 3-year-old has died as a result of being shot in the neck by a sawn-off shotgun, it was probably only one shot. Anybody who's added S to the gunshot, they've been, I don't know, subconsciously exaggerating. But anyway, the situation is that they've got a dead toddler. They've got daddy Toddler's daddy anyway, who was breaking a domestic violence order to visit Toddler's mummy. And somehow, while otherwise preoccupied with talking to mummy, presumably, he's left a sawn-off shotgun and ammunition in a place where 4 children were able to get at it. And while the 4 children had access to the firearm, the youngest of the children is dead, and the immediate story is that the little girl shot herself. And because it's a sawn-off shotgun, yeah, you could do that. You could do that, but you could only do it once. You couldn't fire a second shot if you hit yourself in the neck with a sawn-off shotgun when you're 3. As it happens, just at the moment, here in Australia, we're in the middle of what they call a firearms amnesty. And as it happens, I am, in fact, in possession of a copy of Tuesday, August 22nd, 2017's Glen Innes Examiner. And here we have a front page feature story, which goes roughly thereabout thusly. Firearms amnesty by Steve Evans. A Glen Innes firearms dealer said that 40 guns had been handed in to him with half of the amnesty on illegal firearms over, but none of the guns seemed suspicious. Nick Ward of Grey Street Spare Parts, which is allowed to accept firearms handed in either to be destroyed or to be registered, said criminals were unlikely to take the opportunity. They aren't going to wake up one morning and say, okay, there's an amnesty, I'll hand it in. The amnesty is from July 1 to September 30. And he hopes more people will come forward to put themselves on the right side of the law. The amnesty was announced earlier this year to try to calm fears about gun violence and illegal weapons in criminal hands. Mr. Ward said about 40 weapons had been handed into his business, half to be destroyed and the rest to be registered and then taken away by the owner legally. Quote, most of them are old bits of rubbish, basically, unquote, he said. Quote, there are a couple of guns that are okay, but nothing of any great value and nothing dangerous, unquote. But there is no doubt there are illegal guns still out there, some of them modern and fit for firing to commit crime. Last week, Glen Innes Court heard how a loaded semi-automatic rifle ready to be fired was found on the back seat of a car that the police stopped. There were live rounds in the chamber of the gun and in a magazine. The arrested man, Joshua Sheridan, told the police he got the gun from a friend but wouldn't say who that person was. He told the court he, quote, didn't want to get his friend into the matter, unquote, nor could he explain why he had a loaded weapon. He was found guilty of having a prohibited firearm and a loaded firearm in a public place. Magistrate Michael Holmes said this was a, quote, serious matter. The offender was fined $1,300 but escaped jail. He was given a suspended sentence. For the next 12 months, you will be walking on eggshells, unquote, Mr. Holmes warned Sheridan. That's where firearms law is in Australia. The reason that young fellow was busted and charged and convicted for having a semi-automatic rifle is because we haven't been permitted semi-automatic rifles here for like 20 years. The reason is there is no sporting use for a semi-automatic rifle. If you can't get close enough to hit the game in the head with a single shot from a modern rifle with modern sights, then you don't actually deserve to be out there in the field running around with a gun. If you need to have 15 or 20 or 35 shots, bang, 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 you're not a sportsman. You're a fantasist, a wannabe, practicing for the day when you get the shits with the world in general and decide to pull a fucking massacre. The only conceivable use for a shortened shotgun that I can personally imagine, which doesn't involve using it to point at other humans, is if somebody spends so much time riding horses in the bush and being at risk of being attacked by, say, feral pigs, that they really need something that's a lot shorter than a rifle, but they haven't got the balls to go to the local court and ask for a pistol licence so that they can ride around their property in the scrub, mustering cattle once or twice a year with some kind of a ballistic projectile firearm strapped to their hip, which is short enough that if a pig comes out from behind a bush and tries to gore the horse's leg, they can take it out. And I know that this happens because I know a man who had to actually go to court and state his case as such, in those terms particularly, and he actually told the magistrate, when the magistrate suggested that he should be able to use a rifle, he said perhaps the magistrate had been watching too many Wild Western movies on the television. And they gave him a licence for his pistol. So the only person who really might perhaps possibly, quote, need, unquote, to modify a shotgun so it's got a short barrel or barrels and no shoulder stop is someone who hasn't got the intestinal fortitude, the courage, the guts to go into court and ask for a pistol licence for whatever reason it is that they need to have a pistol to wander around in Australia. Because, like the fact is, the Australian wildlife doesn't come up and attack you. If you tread on them, you can expect a snake to maybe perhaps bite you. If you approach their nest in the season, you can expect magpies to swoop you. You can expect plovers to swoop you. If you get between a snake that's got nowhere to run away from and a clear open space, you can expect that snake to go full speed towards you in the hope of getting past you before you can respond. But unless you feel like swimming in waterholes in northern Australia where there are saltwater crocodiles, or perhaps unless somebody introduces Komodo dragons or Gila monsters to northern Australia as a biological control against feral goats, then no, you don't actually need any kind of a ballistic projectile weapon, firearm or bow and arrow, to defend yourself against the Australian wildlife, because the Australian wildlife has got kind of like, 60,000 years of practice at leaving humans the fuck alone. So you got this situation where some idiot who's got a kid to a woman with 4 kids, I don't know how many of the other ones were his kids, who lives somewhere else, has showed up at his missus's place and he's brought his sawn-off shotgun to talk to his, this must be a strange missus because he was defying an apprehended domestic violence order in order to be there. And a 3-year-old has finished up being shotgunned in the neck. I'm afraid I really agree with the Commissioner of Police. This is an absolutely perfect example of why the more people have guns in their possession, readily accessible, carrying them around loaded, or at least with ammunition accessible to them, just on the off chance that they might suddenly have a need for them. And I don't care whether the need is criminal or, quote, legitimate. Like if you want to shoot somebody else or menace somebody else with a shotgun, that is a morally and ethically questionable, quote, need. But it really sort of seems to me, like as we sit here, living on the outside skin of a planet orbiting a continuous hydrogen fusion reaction, I just don't see why it's a clever idea to have or to keep firearms in a place where children can have access to them. It's just absolutely bloody stupid. I can understand why some firearms are prohibited, and shortened shotguns are a firearm that probably needs to be prohibited. I understand all the reasons why they're great fun to play with if you haven't got what it takes to get an actual pistol license, but no, you shouldn't have a shortened shotgun, and you shouldn't leave it where kids could get at it. Certainly not when there's ammunition close enough handy that one of the kids could contrive to fire the gun and kill one of the kids. Ask Chuck Yeager when he was a primary school age boy. Chuck Yeager and his little brother shotgunned their 3-year-old sister to death. Chuck Yeager and his brother were 5 and 7 at the time. True story. That's General Chuck Yeager, the man who broke the sound barrier, the fellow they made the movie The Right Stuff about. Yeah, the fellow who in his autobiography, Ghost Written, used to talk about weak sisters who had to be weeded out before they risked somebody else in combat. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.